Under sealed Munitorum archives and scattered Mechanicus data vaults, early references to a widely deployed armoured vehicle appear not as a single cohesive record, but as fragmented observations. These include degraded picked feeds recovered from abandoned compliance worlds, partial battlefield surveys conducted decades after engagements had ended, and eyewitness testimonies extracted from Astra Militarum veterans whose recollections often disagreed on fine detail but aligned on function. Many of these early records describe a medium-mass tracked vehicle, operating in conditions that rendered heavier engines immobile and lighter platforms ineffective. The vehicle is repeatedly associated with harsh terrain, limited supply chains, and prolonged ground campaigns where repair, adaptation, and mass production were prioritized over elegance or technological novelty. Several of the earliest Mechanicus annotations identify the chassis through comparison rather than designation. Analysts note similarities to pre-Imperial standard template construct armoured patterns, particularly those optimized for manufacturability across worlds with limited industrial specialization. Pit captures show slab-sided armor, a low-profile turret, and a suspension system tolerant of uneven ground and battlefield debris. Environmental context varies widely, ranging from ash plains and tundra zones to hive outskirts and desert approaches. In each instance, the vehicle's presence is noted as consistent rather than exceptional, suggesting it was already considered a baseline asset rather than an experimental deployment. Some administratum archivists argue that this absence of ceremonial introduction is itself significant. Unlike rare war engines whose origins are marked by grand decrees or singular Forge World claims, this tank appears to have entered service quietly, almost anonymously, its value determined through repetition and endurance rather than prestige. Fragmented expeditionary logs from the closing years of the Great Crusade reference armoured support units that match later specifications, though naming conventions are inconsistent and often redacted or lost to data corruption. These early, indirect findings collectively converge on a single subject designation, once later cross-referenced and standardized within Imperial records: the Leman Russ Battle Tank. The origin of the Leman Russ Battle Tank is inseparable from the rediscovery and formalization of standard template construct patterns during the early Imperium. Mechanicus doctrine holds that the core design derives from an ancient human template optimized for colonial warfare and planetary defense. Unlike archaeotech constructs that rely on rare materials or advanced cognitive systems, this pattern emphasized reliability, ease of replication, and tolerance for suboptimal maintenance conditions. This philosophy aligned closely with the Imperium's expanding need for armored vehicles that could be produced on thousands of Forge worlds with varying levels of technical sophistication. The association with the Primarch Leman Russ does not indicate authorship or direct design input. Instead, Imperial tradition holds that the vehicle was named in honor of the Primarch of the 6th Legion, whose doctrines emphasized aggressive advance, close support of infantry, and relentless pressure against enemy lines. Administratum historians note that such naming conventions were common during the consolidation of Imperial military identity, where symbolic association was used to reinforce morale and ideological unity. No primary source places Leman Russ himself in direct connection with the tank's development or deployment. Construction of the Leman Russ Battle Tank follows a modular design philosophy. The hull is built around a riveted and welded armoured frame that can be assembled using standardized components. Armour plating thickness varies by production era and Forge world, but the overall profile remains consistent. The internal layout prioritizes accessibility of mechanical systems, allowing field crews to perform repairs with limited tools and training. This internal pragmatism is frequently highlighted in Mechanicus manufacturing treatises as a key reason for the pattern's longevity. The primary production hubs for the Leman Russ have shifted across millennia. Early mass manufacture is attributed to major Forge worlds such as Mars, Riza, and Lucius, though secondary and tertiary production facilities rapidly expanded across the Segmentum Solar and beyond. Each Forge world introduced minor variations based on local material availability and doctrinal preferences, resulting in a wide range of sub-patterns that nevertheless remained mechanically compatible. The Adeptus Mechanicus tolerated these deviations so long as the core template integrity was preserved. Power generation within the Leman Russ Battle Tank relies on a robust internal engine system, most commonly a multi-fuel combustion engine adapted to Imperial standards. This engine is capable of operating on a variety of refined and semi-refined fuels, including promethium derivatives. Mechanicus records emphasize that this flexibility was not an afterthought, but a deliberate design choice inherited from the original template. The engine compartment is heavily armoured and isolated from the crew space to reduce catastrophic failure in the event of penetration. Some later production variants incorporate limited plasma-assisted systems to improve efficiency, though full plasma reactors are generally avoided in this pattern due to maintenance complexity and risk. The prevailing doctrine favours engines that can be repaired by engineers with basic rights and replacement parts, rather than those requiring specialised Forge World intervention. As a result, the Leman Russ has remained viable even in war zones cut off from reliable supply lines for extended periods. The power transmission system drives a tracked propulsion arrangement designed for stability rather than speed. The suspension uses reinforced road wheels and heavy treads, capable of traversing mud, rubble, snow and ash wastes. Field reports repeatedly note that while the vehicle is not fast by armoured standards, it maintains consistent mobility where more advanced platforms stall or suffer mechanical failure. This consistency is frequently cited in post-action reports as a decisive factor during prolonged ground engagements. From an engineering perspective, the Leman Russ Battle Tank embodies the Imperium's broader strategic philosophy. It does not represent the peak of technological achievement, nor does it attempt to outclass enemy armour through sophistication alone. Instead, it is built to be present everywhere, in vast numbers, functioning adequately under almost any condition. Mechanicus commentaries often describe the design as intentionally conservative, favouring known quantities over innovation that could introduce failure points. The construction process itself reinforces this mindset. Assembly lines for the Leman Russ are structured to allow partial automation supplemented by manual labour and servitor assistance. This hybrid approach ensures continued output even during resource shortages or labour disruptions. Ritualised quality checks focus on structural integrity and engine performance rather than aesthetic uniformity. Variations in external finish, rivet placement, and minor fittings are common and considered acceptable. Early deployment records suggest that the Leman Russ Battle Tank quickly became a cornerstone of Imperial armoured doctrine. Its introduction coincided with the Imperium's transition from rapid conquest to long-term occupation and defence. Worlds brought into compliance required permanent garrisons capable of responding to rebellion, Xenos incursions and environmental hazards. The Leman Russ fulfilled this role by providing a reliable armoured presence that could be sustained indefinitely. Over time, the tank's origin story became less a matter of historical record and more a matter of institutional memory. The original standard template construct from which it derives is considered partially lost, preserved only through continuous reproduction rather than complete archival retention. This has not diminished its status. If anything, the tank's endurance across 10,000 years of warfare has elevated it to a near symbolic representation of the Astra Militarum itself. In this context, the Leman Russ Battle Tank is best understood not as a singular invention, but as the product of accumulated necessity. Its construction reflects the realities of a galactic empire stretched across countless worlds, each with its own limitations. Its power source reflects the Imperium's acceptance of practicality over perfection. Its continued use reflects a doctrine that values reliability, mass, and adaptability above all else. By the opening centuries of Millennia 41, year by year, production continued largely unchanged from patterns established thousands of years earlier. Minor refinements were introduced, but the foundational design remained intact. This continuity stands as evidence of the tank's effectiveness within the constraints of Imperial warfare. Where other designs faded into obsolescence or rarity, the Leman Russ persisted, not through reverence alone, but through constant, unglamorous utility. The origins, construction methods, and power systems of the Leman Russ Battle Tank therefore form the groundwork for understanding its later specifications, battlefield performance, and eventual fate. It is a machine defined less by a moment of creation and more by an unbroken chain of use, repair, and reproduction, stretching from the Imperium's earliest expansions to its current age of unending war. The standardized specifications of the Leman Russ Battle Tank emerged gradually through accumulated battlefield data rather than a single, immutable technical decree. Administratum records indicate that while core dimensions and mass tolerances were established early, exact measurements were allowed to fluctuate within sanctioned margins. This flexibility ensured that production could continue across forge worlds, with differing industrial capabilities, while still maintaining interoperability of parts and tactical doctrine. In its most common pattern, the Leman Russ Battle Tank measures approximately 7 meters in length from frontal glacis to rear hull plating. Width typically exceeds 3.5 meters when accounting for track assemblies, while overall height remains relatively low for a main battle tank, generally under 3 meters to the top of the turret. This compact vertical profile was a deliberate design decision, reducing exposure to enemy fire and allowing the vehicle to make use of limited cover in urban and industrial environments. Combat weight varies by pattern and armor reinforcement, but most examples fall within the 60 to 70 ton range. Armor composition is layered rather than monolithic. The outer plating consists of thick ceramite-reinforced steel alloys, chosen for their resistance to kinetic penetration and thermal stress. Beneath this outer shell lies a secondary structural layer designed to absorb shock and distribute impact forces across the hull. Internal spool liners are inconsistently installed depending on Forge World doctrine, though later millennia saw increased adoption following repeated crew casualty analyses. Armor thickness is heaviest on the frontal arc, particularly the glacis plate and turret face, where it is angled to deflect incoming fire rather than relying solely on raw mass. Side and rear armor is comparatively thinner, reflecting the assumption that the tank would advance head-on in concert with infantry support. This doctrinal choice shaped battlefield use for thousands of years, encouraging formations that minimized flank exposure. While critics within the Adeptus Mechanicus have periodically proposed thicker lateral armor, such modifications were often rejected due to increased strain on the engine and suspension systems. Mobility specifications place the Leman Russ firmly within the category of steady, reliable advance rather than rapid maneuver warfare. Maximum road speed under ideal conditions is recorded at approximately 35 km per hour, though sustained operational speed is usually lower. Off-road performance drops further, averaging 20 km per hour across broken terrain, ash wastes, or soft ground. These figures are consistently supported by field data from multiple campaigns across different segments. Acceleration is slow but predictable. The tank's power-to-weight ratio is modest, reflecting the limitations of its internal combustion engine relative to its mass. However, this perceived weakness is offset by exceptional torque delivery at low speeds, allowing the vehicle to climb inclines, push through debris, and maintain forward motion under heavy load. Reports frequently note that while faster enemy armor may outmaneuver a Leman Russ initially, the Imperial tank often outlasts them during prolonged engagements where mechanical reliability becomes decisive. The tracked propulsion system is one of the vehicle's most defining strengths. Each track assembly is composed of oversized links designed to distribute weight evenly and reduce ground pressure. This allows the tank to traverse mud, snow, sand, and rubble with minimal risk of bogging down. The suspension system, while primitive by advanced technological standards, is exceptionally durable. Broken road wheels or damaged track segments can often be replaced in the field using standardized components carried by support units. Steering is achieved through differential track control rather than advanced servo-assisted systems. This results in wide turning arcs and reduced agility in confined spaces, but it also reduces mechanical complexity. In the context of Imperial warfare, this trade-off is considered acceptable. Training manuals emphasize positioning and advanced planning over reactive maneuvering, reinforcing the tank's role as a blunt instrument rather than a finesse platform. The structural strength of the Leman Russ Battle Tank extends beyond its armour. The hull frame is reinforced to withstand repeated concussive forces from both enemy fire and its own primary weapon discharge. Stress fractures are rare even after extended combat service, provided routine maintenance rights are observed. Mechanicus analyses highlight that many tanks remain operational for centuries, undergoing multiple refits and weapon replacements without requiring complete hull reconstruction. Internally, crew survivability is treated as secondary to vehicle durability. The standard crew complement consists of 4 personnel: commander, gunner, loader, and driver. In some patterns, additional crew members are assigned to operate secondary weapons or manage communications. Crew compartments are cramped, with limited environmental controls. Heat, noise, and vibration are constant factors, contributing to high fatigue during extended operations. Despite this, casualty rates remain lower than expected due to the tank's ability to absorb punishment that would destroy lighter vehicles outright. The primary armament of the Leman Russ Battle Tank defines its battlefield role more than any other single component. The most common configuration mounts a large caliber battle cannon housed within a fully rotating turret. This weapon is designed for versatility rather than specialization, capable of firing high explosive, armor-piercing and specialized shells depending on mission requirements. Effective engagement range typically extends beyond 2 kilometers under optimal conditions, though accuracy decreases significantly while moving. Recoil management systems are integrated directly into the turret assembly, using a combination of hydraulic dampeners and reinforced mounting brackets. This allows the tank to fire repeatedly without compromising structural integrity. Reload time is dependent on crew proficiency and ammunition type, but sustained rates of fire are achievable in defensive positions. Administratum after-action reports frequently cite the psychological impact of battle cannon fire, noting its ability to break enemy formations even when direct hits are limited. Secondary armament supplements the primary weapon and provides close-range defense. A hull-mounted heavy bolter is standard in most patterns, operated by the gunner or a dedicated crew member. This weapon is intended to suppress infantry and light vehicles approaching from the front. Additional heavy bolters or heavy flamers may be mounted in sponsons on either side of the hull, significantly increasing fire coverage at the cost of added weight and maintenance complexity. The inclusion of sponson weapons reflects a doctrinal emphasis on combined firepower rather than streamlined efficiency. While some commanders favour sponsonless configurations to improve speed and reduce logistical burden, many prefer the increased lethality in urban and trench warfare. Statistical analysis from multiple siege campaigns indicates that sponson-equipped tanks achieve higher infantry suppression rates, though they also suffer increased mechanical wear. A pintle-mounted weapon, often a heavy stubber or stormbolter, is typically assigned to the commander's hatch. This provides limited anti-infantry capability and allows the commander to engage targets independently of the main gun. Use of this weapon exposes the commander to enemy fire, leading to mixed opinions regarding its effectiveness. Nevertheless, its continued inclusion reflects tradition as much as tactical necessity. Ammunition storage is distributed throughout the hull and turret in armoured racks. Early patterns suffered from catastrophic internal detonations when penetrated, but later refinements improved compartmentalization and blast venting. Despite these improvements, ammunition cook-offs remain a known risk. Training emphasizes careful ammunition handling and prioritization of target selection to minimize exposure during reload cycles. The tank's communication and targeting systems are basic but functional. Optical sights dominate, supplemented by limited Auspex integration in later millennia. These systems are less precise than those found in more advanced Imperial vehicles, but they are resistant to electronic warfare and environmental interference. In dust storms, electromagnetic disturbances, or void shield saturation zones, the Leman Russ often retains operational capability where more complex systems fail. Strength in the context of the Leman Russ Battle Tank is therefore multifaceted. It is not the fastest, most heavily armoured, or most technologically advanced vehicle in Imperial service. Instead, its strength lies in balance. Each specification is tuned to avoid extremes, creating a platform that performs adequately across a vast range of conditions. This balance allows commanders to deploy the tank with confidence, knowing its limitations are predictable and its failures manageable. Gear and auxiliary equipment further support this role. Standard issue includes external stowage racks for tools, spare track links, and personal equipment. Smoke launchers are mounted on the turret to provide concealment during advances or withdrawals. Some patterns include dozer blades for obstacle clearance, particularly in siege or urban operations. These additions increase versatility without fundamentally altering the tank's operational profile. Over time, countless localized modifications have been recorded. Some units reinforce armor with improvised plating, while others adjust weapon loadouts to match specific threats. The Adeptus Mechanicus tolerates these changes provided they do not violate core template principles. This permissive attitude has allowed the Leman Russ to evolve organically, while retaining its essential identity. By examining its specifications, speed, strength, and armament in aggregate, a clear picture emerges. The Leman Russ Battle Tank is engineered to be present, persistent, and punishing. Its weapons are powerful but unsophisticated. Its speed is limited but reliable. Its strength is not absolute but enduring. These qualities have ensured its continued relevance across millennia of warfare, setting the stage for understanding the individuals who crew it, the purposes it serves, and the ultimate fate of countless examples across the Imperium. The operation of the Leman Russ Battle Tank has always been inseparable from the individuals who crew it. While Imperial doctrine often frames armoured warfare in terms of formations and material strength, archival records consistently demonstrate that the effectiveness of the tank depends heavily on the discipline, endurance, and institutional conditioning of its crew. The Leman Russ is not automated, nor does it rely on advanced machine cognition. It is a human-operated war engine, demanding constant physical presence and coordination under extreme conditions. The standard crew configuration consists of 4 individuals, though this varies by pattern and regimental doctrine. The driver occupies the forward hull, seated low behind thick frontal armour. Visibility is limited to narrow vision slits and periscopic optics, forcing reliance on training and spatial awareness rather than situational clarity. Administratum training manuals emphasize that drivers are selected not for initiative, but for consistency and obedience to command cues. Fine motor skill is less important than the ability to maintain steady control over long durations while under fire. The gunner is positioned within the turret, responsible for aiming and firing the primary weapon and, in many patterns, the hull-mounted armament. This role demands technical proficiency, familiarity with ammunition types, and the ability to operate targeting optics under stress. Unlike advanced Imperial vehicles equipped with stabilizers and predictive targeting systems, the Leman Russ requires manual correction and disciplined timing. Accuracy is achieved through experience rather than technological assistance, reinforcing the tank's reliance on trained personnel rather than machine precision. The loader works in close proximity to the gunner, managing ammunition transfer from storage racks to the breech. This role is physically demanding and often performed in extreme heat and noise. Fatigue-related errors are a documented concern, particularly during prolonged engagements. As a result, loader rotation and crew drills are emphasized in regimental preparation. Despite these measures, casualty and injury rates among loaders remain high, largely due to the confined workspace and exposure during ammunition handling. The commander occupies the highest position within the turret, overseeing target selection, coordination with infantry and supporting units, and communication with command elements. This role carries the greatest cognitive burden. Commanders are trained to balance aggression with survivability, knowing that overextension can expose the tank's weaker flanks or isolate it from support. The commander's external awareness is often limited, especially when hatches are sealed, leading to reliance on reports from infantry or auspex readings when available. Socially, tank crews form tight-knit micro-units within the Astra Militarum. Shared confinement, mutual dependence, and prolonged exposure to combat stress produce strong internal bonds. Administratum sociological studies note that tank crews often develop a collective identity centered on their vehicle, treating it as both workplace and protective barrier. This attachment is tolerated and sometimes encouraged, as it correlates with higher maintenance diligence and operational cohesion. The purpose of the Leman Russ Battle Tank within Imperial doctrine is clearly defined and remarkably consistent across millennia. It exists to provide armoured fire support to infantry formations, to break enemy lines through direct assault, and to hold ground once seized. Unlike specialised vehicles designed for reconnaissance, rapid exploitation or precision strikes, the Leman Russ is intended to dominate contested terrain through presence and sustained firepower. Strategically, the tank serves as the backbone of Astra Militarum armoured regiments. Its widespread availability allows for predictable force composition and simplifies logistical planning. Commanders can assume the presence of Leman Russ units in most theatres of ground warfare, enabling standardised tactics and training across the Imperium. This predictability is considered a strength rather than a limitation, reducing uncertainty in an environment already defined by chaos and attrition. Tactically, the Leman Russ is deployed in formations that emphasise frontal engagement. It advances alongside infantry, absorbing enemy fire while delivering suppressive and destructive fire in return. The tank's armour is optimised for this role, encouraging head-on confrontation rather than manoeuvre warfare. Administratum after-action reports consistently describe the tank as a line holder and line breaker, terms that reflect its dual role in offence and defence. In siege warfare, the Leman Russ excels through endurance. Its ability to operate continuously with minimal resupply makes it ideal for prolonged bombardment and counter-assault duties. Tanks are often positioned at breach points or along defensive perimeters, where their firepower can be brought to bear repeatedly without repositioning. Over time, many tanks acquire extensive battle damage yet remain operational, reinforcing their reputation as stubborn, unyielding assets. Urban combat presents a more complex picture. The Leman Russ lacks the agility and situational awareness needed for tight city fighting, making it vulnerable to ambush. Nevertheless, Imperial doctrine continues to employ it in such environments due to its availability and firepower. Success in these scenarios depends heavily on infantry coordination and careful route planning. Loss rates increase, but so does psychological impact, as the presence of a battle tank in confined spaces often demoralises defenders. Beyond immediate battlefield roles, the Leman Russ also serves a symbolic purpose. Its silhouette is widely recognised across the Imperium, representing imperial authority and military inevitability. On newly pacified worlds, the deployment of Leman Russ units is often one of the first visible signs of imperial control. This symbolic function is explicitly acknowledged in administratum propaganda assessments, which identify the tank as a visual shorthand for imperial might. Over the course of its operational life, each Leman Russ battle tank accumulates a unique service history. Unlike rare relic vehicles preserved for ceremonial use, most Leman Russ tanks are continuously deployed, repaired, and redeployed until structural failure or catastrophic destruction renders them irrecoverable. There is no formal concept of retirement for these vehicles. Their service ends only when they can no longer be made functional. The final fate of a Leman Russ battle tank varies widely. Some are destroyed outright in combat, reduced to twisted hulls and scattered debris. Others are abandoned due to immobilization or battlefield conditions, later salvaged by recovery crews or stripped for parts by local forces. In many cases, wrecks remain where they fell, gradually becoming part of the landscape. Archaeological surveys on long-contested worlds frequently uncover rusted hulls, partially buried beneath sediment or overgrown by native flora. When recovery is possible, damaged tanks are returned to repair facilities where they undergo extensive refurbishment. Hulls deemed structurally sound may be rebuilt multiple times, receiving new engines, weapons and armour plates while retaining the original frame. Mechanicus records show examples of Leman Russ tanks remaining in service for several centuries through successive rebuilds. In such cases, continuity of identity is maintained through serial numbers and machine rights, rather than physical continuity of components. Tanks that are beyond repair are not wasted. Their remains are systematically cannibalized for usable parts, which are redistributed across maintenance networks. Even scrap metal is reclaimed and melted down for reuse. This process reflects the Imperium's broader material philosophy, where nothing of potential utility is discarded. The death of a tank thus contributes indirectly to the continued operation of others. In rare instances, particularly storied vehicles are preserved as monuments or training relics. These examples are exceptions rather than the rule, and are typically associated with significant victories or regimental traditions. Such tanks are stripped of functional components and rendered inert, serving as symbols rather than weapons. Administratum records emphasize that this practice is discouraged during active campaigns, as it removes potentially recoverable assets from circulation. From a broader historical perspective, the fate of the Leman Russ Battle Tank is indistinguishable from the fate of the Imperium itself. It is built to endure, to be used until destruction, and to be replaced without ceremony. There is no final planned obsolescence, no scheduled transition to a successor pattern. Despite the existence of more advanced armoured vehicles, the Leman Russ continues to be produced and deployed in vast numbers. This persistence is not due to inertia alone. Continuous battlefield data confirms that the tank remains effective within its intended role. Losses are accepted as a statistical certainty, offset by production capacity and logistical depth. The Imperium does not seek perfection in individual machines, but sufficiency at scale. The Leman Russ embodies this principle fully. In closing the examination of pilot, purpose and final fate, the Leman Russ Battle Tank emerges as a fundamentally human-centered machine. It relies on crews rather than automation, doctrine rather than innovation, and endurance rather than elegance. Its purpose is clear and narrowly defined, and its fate is almost always violent, utilitarian, and unremarked upon. Yet through this cycle of deployment, destruction, and replacement, the tank has achieved a form of permanence. Individual vehicles are transient, but the pattern endures. Across countless battlefields and uncounted campaigns, the Leman Russ continues to fulfill the same role it was designed for millennia ago, advancing under fire, crewed by ordinary soldiers, and ending its service not with ceremony but with silence. Within the administrative and technical organs of the Imperium, the Leman Russ Battle Tank occupies a uniquely well-documented yet curiously understated position. Adeptus Administratum impressions of the vehicle are shaped less by battlefield heroics and more by decades of logistical accounting, attrition forecasting, and deployment statistics. In contrast, the Adeptus Mechanicus approaches the same machine through the lens of manufacturability, ritual compliance, and long-term pattern stability. Together, their records form a parallel narrative that is largely absent from frontline histories, but critical to understanding why the Leman Russ remains dominant within Astra Militarum armoured doctrine. Administratum assessments consistently frame the Leman Russ as a stabilizing variable within otherwise volatile war projections. Across multiple segmentum-level campaigns, logistical analysts note that armoured formations equipped primarily with Leman Russ patterns exhibit predictable consumption rates of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. This predictability is not viewed as trivial. In a bureaucratic system that must coordinate the movement of billions of personnel and trillions of tons of material, stability is considered a strategic asset. The Leman Russ, by virtue of its unchanged core specifications over millennia, reduces uncertainty in planning models. Supply chain documentation indicates that the tank's components are among the most widely standardized mechanical items in the Imperium. Track links, road wheels, engine components, and weapon sub-assemblies are produced in vast quantities across forge worlds of varying prominence. Administratum cross-sector audits repeatedly highlight that no single forge world is indispensable to Leman Russ production. This decentralization is viewed as a safeguard against disruption from warp storms, rebellion, or Xenos attack. Even when major Forge worlds are lost or isolated, output can be compensated through secondary facilities with minimal retraining or retooling. From a purely numerical perspective, the Leman Russ demonstrates favourable cost-to-output ratios when compared to heavier armoured platforms. While exact production figures are classified and vary by era, Administratum budgetary summaries consistently show that for the same resource allocation, significantly more Leman Russ tanks can be fielded than super heavy or specialised vehicles. Analysts often emphasise that this numerical advantage translates directly into battlefield resilience. Losses can be absorbed without compromising operational capability, allowing commanders to sustain pressure even under high attrition conditions. The Adeptus Mechanicus, while less concerned with numerical abstraction, echoes similar conclusions through different terminology. Mechanicus impressions describe the Leman Russ pattern as stable, doctrinally pure, and richly complete. These descriptors refer not to religious sentiment alone, but to the vehicle's resistance to template drift. Over 10,000 years of continuous production, the core Leman Russ pattern has remained remarkably intact. Minor deviations are catalogued, approved, and incorporated into recognized sub-patterns rather than proliferating unchecked. Mechanicus data logs suggest that this stability reduces the cognitive and ritual burden on engine seers. Training in the maintenance rights of the Leman Russ transfers easily between Forge worlds, reducing the risk of doctrinal error or machine spirit misalignment. In contrast, more advanced vehicles often require specialized knowledge that cannot be disseminated widely without dilution. The Leman Russ therefore aligns closely with the Mechanicus preference for systems that can be maintained by large numbers of moderately trained personnel rather than a small cadre of specialists. Logistical findings from joint Administratum and Mechanicus audits place particular emphasis on field maintainability. Reports indicate that a significant proportion of Leman Russ mechanical failures do not require full withdrawal from the front. Damaged track assemblies, suspension components, and even engine subsystems can often be repaired within forward operating zones using pre-positioned spares. This capability reduces turnaround time and limits the burden on long-range transport assets, which are frequently overextended. Fuel logistics further reinforce the tank's administrative appeal. The multi-fuel engine design allows Leman Russ units to operate on a range of Prometheum-based fuels with minimal adjustment. Administratum supply officers note that this flexibility simplifies integration into diverse theatres where fuel refinement standards may vary. While efficiency is not optimal, the ability to keep vehicles operational under substandard conditions is valued more highly than peak performance metrics. Ammunition analytics reveals similar trends. The primary battle cannon uses standardized shell types that are produced in enormous quantities across the Imperium. Storage, transport, and distribution networks are optimized around these munitions, reducing the need for specialized handling. Administratum reports frequently contrast this with vehicles that rely on rare or volatile ammunition, which introduces bottlenecks and increased risk during resupply operations. The Adeptus Mechanicus contributes an additional layer of analysis concerning production rituals and failure rates. Long-term data indicates that Leman Russ assembly lines experience lower rates of catastrophic defect than those producing more complex vehicles. This is attributed to the relative simplicity of the design and the extensive historical refinement of its construction rights. Each step of the manufacturing process is supported by centuries of accumulated corrective annotations, reducing variance between individual units. From a systems perspective, Mechanicus analysts often describe the Leman Russ as approaching an equilibrium state. Innovations are incremental and rarely disruptive. When modifications are introduced, such as alternative weapon mounts or reinforced armor packages, they are tested extensively and either absorbed into the recognized pattern framework or quietly discontinued. This conservative approach minimizes the risk of widespread faults propagating through the armored fleet. Administratum impressions of battlefield performance, filtered through casualty and outcome reports, reinforce the perception of adequacy rather than excellence. Statistical summaries show that Leman Russ units rarely achieve disproportionate kill ratios when compared to elite armoured formations. However, they also rarely underperform relative to expectations. This consistency supports a planning philosophy that prioritises reliability over exceptional outcomes. In large-scale conflicts, where individual tactical brilliance is often subsumed by sheer scale, this reliability becomes decisive. Administratum analysts frequently note that wars are lost not through single, catastrophic defeats, but through cumulative logistical failure. In this context, the Leman Russ is viewed as a hedge against collapse. Its losses are predictable, its replacements readily available, and its operational demands well understood. Mechanicus interpretations occasionally verge into speculative territory regarding the machine spirit of the Leman Russ. Some engine-seer treatises suggest that the long continuity of pattern and ritual has produced a particularly compliant machine spirit, one less prone to erratic behaviour than those of more complex constructs. While such claims remain unverified and are treated cautiously by administratum observers, they persist within Mechanicus discourse as an explanatory framework for the tank's operational reliability. Joint logistical simulations conducted during major crusade preparations further illustrate institutional confidence in the Leman Russ. War plans often assume a baseline armoured presence composed primarily of this pattern, with specialised vehicles allocated only where necessary. This assumption simplifies modelling and reduces the computational burden on administratum planning departments, which must already contend with incomplete or contradictory data from distant war zones. Transport analytics also favour the Leman Russ. Its dimensions and mass fall within the tolerances of most Imperial transport vessels and landing craft. This compatibility reduces the need for specialised conveyance and allows armoured units to be redeployed with relative speed. Administratum shipping manifests indicate that mixed cargo holds containing infantry, supplies, and Leman Russ tanks are common, streamlining embarkation and disembarkation processes. The Adeptus Mechanicus, while acknowledging these advantages, also records the limitations inherent in the design. Datalogs note that the Leman Russ lacks growth potential compared to more modular or advanced platforms. Its internal volume and power output impose hard limits on future upgrades. Mechanicus analysts recognise that this may eventually constrain its effectiveness against emerging threats. However, such concerns are often deferred rather than acted upon, as immediate demands outweigh long-term theoretical obsolescence. Administratum responses to these limitations are pragmatic. Rather than seeking to replace the Leman Russ wholesale, planners favour supplementing it with specialised units when necessary. This layered approach preserves the logistical benefits of the existing armoured backbone while addressing specific tactical gaps. Records show repeated cycles of proposed replacement programs that ultimately stall due to cost, complexity, or insufficient improvement over the established pattern. In aggregate, the impressions recorded by the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus converge on a shared conclusion, albeit expressed through different vocabularies. The Leman Russ Battle Tank is not optimised for excellence, but for sustainability. Its logistical footprint is manageable, its production resilient, and its performance predictable. These qualities align closely with the Imperium's broader strategic realities. What emerges from these administrative and technical perspectives is a view of the Leman Russ as an infrastructural element rather than a weapon of distinction. It is treated as part of the background machinery of war, as essential and unremarkable as supply depots or troop transports. This lack of distinction is not a failure of imagination, but an acknowledgement of function. In the eyes of the Administratum, the Leman Russ simplifies the impossible task of managing galactic warfare. In the eyes of the Mechanicus, it represents a rare example of a pattern that has achieved near-perfect alignment between design intent and operational reality. Together, their records explain not how the Leman Russ wins battles, but why it continues to be present at all. Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus battle records concerning the Leman Russ Battle Tank do not emphasize singular acts of battlefield distinction. Instead, they document repetition. the same armoured pattern appears across thousands of war zones, often under radically different conditions, yet performing within a narrow and predictable behavioural envelope. This consistency allows analysts to trace its operational history not through isolated heroics, but through accumulation. Certain conflicts nevertheless recur within the archives due to scale, duration, or the clarity with which Leman Russ fighting doctrine can be observed. One of the earliest large-scale records frequently referenced by administratum tacticians dates to late Great Crusade-era compliance actions, where armoured cohorts matching later Leman Russ specifications were deployed in planetary pacification campaigns. These early engagements reveal the foundational fighting style that would persist for millennia. Tanks advanced in dense, infantry-supported formations, absorbing fire while delivering sustained cannon bombardment against fixed positions. Speed was subordinate to cohesion. Breakthroughs were achieved not through maneuver, but through attritional pressure applied across a wide front. By the opening centuries of Millennia 31, this fighting style had become codified. During prolonged compliance actions against entrenched human separatist regimes, records describe Leman Russ formations advancing methodically, halting to fire, then resuming movement only once resistance diminished. Administratum battle summaries repeatedly note that command elements favoured predictable advances because they reduced coordination failures between armoured and infantry units. The tank's limited agility was therefore not considered a weakness, but a factor that enforced doctrinal discipline. In later millennia, the tank's role became more clearly defined during conflicts against non-human forces. During orc invasions across multiple segmentum theatres, Leman Russ units were deployed as forward anchors in defensive lines. Battle data from these wars emphasises the tank's ability to withstand sustained assault. Orc tactics frequently relied on massed frontal attacks, which aligned with the Leman Russ's strongest armour orientation. Engagement logs show tanks remaining operational despite extensive superficial damage, continuing to fire until ammunition depletion or mechanical failure forced withdrawal. These orc wars also illustrate the tank's preferred engagement range. Administratum fire control records indicate that Leman Russ units performed best when maintaining medium-distance standoff, allowing the battle cannon to engage dense formations before they reached close assault range. Once enemies closed the distance, losses increased sharply, particularly from boarding actions or rear attacks. As a result, later tactical revisions emphasized layered defenses, with infantry and lighter vehicles screening the tank's flanks. Mechanicus after-action analyses from these same conflicts focus on structural endurance. Hull integrity readings taken post-engagement show that while armour penetration occurred with some frequency, catastrophic structural collapse was rare. Tanks were often recovered with significant internal damage yet retained viable hull frames. This reinforced Mechanicus' confidence in the pattern's resilience and informed subsequent decisions to continue mass production without radical redesign. Urban warfare records present a more complex operational picture. During extended hive city conflicts, particularly those involving insurrection or heretical planetary governments, Leman Russ tanks were employed as mobile strongpoints. Administratum battle maps show tanks positioned at major intersections, transit corridors and breach points rather than maneuvering freely through narrow streets. Fighting style in these environments became static and reactive. Tanks fired pre-registered arcs, suppressing enemy movement while infantry cleared adjacent structures. Battle details from these urban campaigns highlight the tank's vulnerability to vertical threats. Repeated losses from upper-level attacks prompted revised deployment protocols, including increased infantry escort density and restricted movement without prior clearance. Despite these losses, administratum assessments conclude that the psychological impact of the tank's presence often outweighed its tactical limitations. Enemy resistance frequently collapsed once armoured units established dominance over key thoroughfares. Siege warfare constitutes another major category of recorded engagement. In planetary sieges lasting years or even decades, Leman Russ units served as both assault engines and defensive artillery. Administratum records from such conflicts emphasize endurance over tempo. Tanks rotated through firing positions, delivering sustained bombardment against fortifications while minimizing exposure to counter-battery fire. Ammunition expenditure rates during these sieges are among the highest recorded, yet fuel and mechanical attrition remain comparatively low. One repeatedly cited siege campaign involved the reduction of a heavily fortified industrial world where Leman Russ units operated continuously for over a decade. Mechanicus maintenance logs from this period show repeated component replacement cycles but remarkably few complete hull losses. Tanks were stripped, repaired, and redeployed in sequence, effectively becoming semi-permanent fixtures of the battlefield. This case is often referenced in Mechanicus discourse as evidence that the Leman Russ functions effectively as a long-term weapons platform rather than a disposable assault asset. Against more technologically advanced adversaries, administratum battle records are less favourable. Conflicts involving highly mobile or precision-oriented enemy forces reveal the tank's limitations. Engagement summaries note difficulties in responding to rapid flanking manoeuvres and long-range anti-armour fire. In such cases, Leman Russ units suffered disproportionate losses unless supported by reconnaissance assets and counter-battery elements. Despite these shortcomings, fighting style adaptations are evident in later records. Rather than advancing independently, Leman Russ formations increasingly operated within combined arms frameworks. Tanks acted as fire bases, while faster elements conducted maneuver operations. This shift did not alter the tank's fundamental role, but mitigated its weaknesses through external support. Administratum evaluations suggest that when employed within such frameworks, Leman Russ effectiveness returned to expected norms. Defensive battles further illustrate the tank's preferred operational context. During planetary defense actions against invading forces, Leman Russ units were positioned to control approach vectors and choke points. Fighting style in these scenarios emphasized hull-down positions and overlapping fields of fire. Battle logs frequently note that tanks engaged enemies multiple times over extended periods, withdrawing only when positions were compromised beyond repair. Mechanicus telemetry from defensive battles highlights lower mechanical stress compared to offensive operations. Reduced movement and predictable firing cycles resulted in fewer breakdowns. This data reinforced the perception that the Leman Russ performs optimally when acting as a stabilizing force rather than a spearhead. Administratum doctrine gradually incorporated this insight, favoring the tank's use in holding actions once breakthroughs were achieved. Naval landing operations provide additional recorded examples. During amphibious or orbital insertion campaigns, Leman Russ tanks were often among the first heavy vehicles deployed. Battle details from these operations emphasize their role in securing landing zones against counterattack. Despite limited mobility immediately after deployment, their firepower and armour provided a deterrent against enemy attempts to disrupt disembarkation. Casualty analytics across these varied battles reveal a consistent pattern. Individual Leman Russ tanks are frequently lost, sometimes in large numbers, yet armoured formations as a whole maintain cohesion. Administratum statisticians interpret this as a feature rather than a flaw. The tank's design assumes attrition and compensates through scale. Battles are won not by preserving every vehicle, but by ensuring enough remain operational to fulfill mission objectives. Mechanicus observers occasionally note anomalous performance variations between units. Some formations demonstrate unusually high survivability or effectiveness, often attributed to crew experience, local modifications, or favourable terrain. These instances are documented but rarely influence broader doctrine, as they are not consistently reproducible across theatres. Across all recorded wars and battles, the fighting style of the Leman Russ remains remarkably stable. It advances deliberately, engages directly, and endures punishment until either the enemy collapses or the vehicle is destroyed. It does not retreat easily, nor does it adapt quickly. Instead, it imposes its tempo on the battlefield, forcing engagements to conform to its strengths. Battle details accumulated over millennia therefore present a clear, if unglamorous, portrait. The Leman Russ Battle Tank does not dominate wars through innovation or superiority. It prevails through presence, repetition, and institutional support. Administratum and Mechanicus records do not celebrate it as an exceptional weapon, but they consistently rely upon it as a known quantity. In the aggregate, these notable wars and engagements do not elevate the Leman Russ to legendary status within Imperial historiography. Instead, they reinforce its role as the Imperium's default armoured solution. Wherever ground war occurs at scale, the same pattern emerges. The same hulls advance, the same cannons fire, the same losses are recorded and replaced. What distinguishes the Leman Russ within these battle records is not the drama of individual engagements, but the fact that its fighting style remains viable across radically different conflicts. Against hordes, fortifications, insurgents, and invading armies alike, it performs within acceptable margins. This consistency, reflected in countless administrative battle summaries, explains why its presence is assumed rather than questioned whenever war is planned. Additional Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus battle records concerning the Leman Russ Battle Tank expand the operational picture beyond frontline engagement and into the prolonged aftermath of war. These records focus less on the moment of contact and more on what follows, including force regeneration, material recovery, and institutional adaptation. In these documents, the tank is treated not as an isolated weapon system, but as a recurring variable within a self-sustaining cycle of conflict. Later stage wars, particularly those fought in the closing centuries of Millennia 41, provide extensive datasets. In many of these conflicts, Leman Russ units were deployed continuously across multiple campaigns with minimal refit intervals. Administratum operational summaries from such wars emphasize endurance under cumulative strain. Tanks entered new engagements already bearing the wear of previous battles, yet remained within acceptable performance parameters. This persistence under degradation is repeatedly cited as a defining characteristic. Several prolonged sector-wide conflicts illustrate this pattern clearly. During extended campaigns against entrenched rebel coalitions, Leman Russ formations were rotated between active fronts rather than withdrawn entirely. Battle records show that tanks were often repaired in theatre, reassigned to different regiments, and redeployed without full documentation transfer. While this practice complicated record keeping, it preserved combat power. Administratum analysts acknowledge the administrative inefficiency, but judge it preferable to the alternative of reduced armoured presence. Mechanicus maintenance logs from these wars reveal a shift in repair philosophy. Rather than restoring vehicles to original specification, engine seers increasingly focused on functional adequacy. Cosmetic damage, non-critical system failures, and minor deviations from standard layout were tolerated if combat capability remained intact. Over time, this produced a class of heavily modified yet mechanically stable tanks, whose appearance diverged from sanctioned patterns while remaining technically compliant. These deviations are catalogued but rarely corrected. Aftermath reports following major engagements often include detailed salvage assessments. Administratum recovery units, operating under Mechanicus supervision, systematically surveyed battlefields for recoverable Leman Russ hulls. Data indicates that a significant proportion of tanks initially listed as destroyed were later reclassified as repairable. This reclassification directly influenced campaign outcomes, as recovered hulls reduced the need for immediate replacement shipments from Forge Worlds. In environments where recovery was not possible, abandoned tanks frequently became static features of the post-war landscape. Administratum planetary assessments note that such wrecks often served secondary functions. Some were incorporated into defensive works by occupying forces. Others became landmarks or were repurposed by local populations. While unofficial, these uses are recorded as part of long-term stabilization analysis, reflecting the tank's lingering material presence even after hostilities ended. Additional battle records also document the tank's role in wars of attrition between Imperial factions and technologically adaptive enemies. In these conflicts, the Leman Russ was rarely decisive on its own. Instead, its contribution lay in absorbing losses that would have crippled more specialized units. Administratum casualty projections demonstrate that replacing lost Leman Russ tanks was consistently faster and less resource-intensive than replacing heavier platforms. This differential influenced strategic decisions, favouring continued use despite known vulnerabilities. Mechanicus evaluative treatises from the same period address concerns regarding technological stagnation. Some magi argue that reliance on the Leman Russ suppresses innovation by consuming industrial capacity that could be directed toward newer designs. Counterarguments emphasize empirical performance data, noting that the tank's continued adequacy under real battlefield conditions undermines the urgency of replacement. These internal debates remain unresolved, but production figures suggest that conservative positions dominate policy. The aftermath of wars also reveals patterns in crew and regimental impact. Administratum personnel records show that armoured regiments equipped with Leman Russ tanks experience high vehicle turnover but relatively stable personnel structures. Crews often transition between vehicles seamlessly, transferring experiential knowledge even as individual tanks are lost. This continuity mitigates the psychological impact of material losses and supports sustained operational tempo. In devastated theatres, Leman Russ wrecks are sometimes encountered decades or centuries later by subsequent Imperial forces. Archaeological and reconnaissance reports describe hulls partially buried, corroded or overgrown, yet still identifiable. In some cases, these relics are stripped for parts long after the original conflict has ended. This delayed recovery extends the tank's logistical utility across temporal boundaries, reinforcing its role as a long-term resource rather than a single-use asset. Administratum strategic reviews conducted after major wars consistently return to the same conclusions. The Leman Russ does not shorten conflicts, nor does it prevent high casualties. However, it enables wars to be fought to conclusion. Its presence ensures that armoured capability remains available even when industrial, logistical and personnel systems are under extreme stress. This capacity to sustain war, rather than to win decisively, aligns with the Imperium's broader strategic reality. The Adeptus Mechanicus final analyses mirror this assessment, while framing it in technical and doctrinal terms. Mechanicus conclaves often describe the Leman Russ pattern as having reached a state of functional sufficiency. It meets the minimum requirements of its role with acceptable margins and does so consistently. Attempts to exceed these requirements through radical redesign are viewed as unnecessary risk, particularly given the pattern's proven survivability within the existing industrial ecosystem. Some Mechanicus analyses include speculative projections regarding long-term viability. These documents acknowledge that emerging threats may eventually exceed the tank's capabilities. Nevertheless, they argue that adaptation through auxiliary systems and combined arms integration is preferable to wholesale replacement. The Leman Russ, in this view, serves as a stable core around which other technologies can orbit. From the administratum perspective, the final analysis is grounded in scale. Wars involving billions of combatants cannot be managed through exceptional solutions. They require systems that function reliably under imperfect conditions. The Leman Russ satisfies this requirement. Its losses are acceptable, its maintenance predictable, and its production scalable. These attributes outweigh its tactical limitations in the calculus of total war. Joint Administratium and Mechanicus review boards occasionally summarize the tank's value using impersonal language. Terms such as acceptable performance, sustainable attrition, and logistical coherence recur throughout final reports. While lacking in rhetorical force, these phrases encapsulate institutional confidence. The tank is trusted not because it excels, but because it endures. In the aftermath of countless wars, the Leman Russ Battle Tank leaves behind a layered legacy. Physically, it leaves wrecks, refurbished hulls, and rebuilt machines cycling back into service. Administratively, it leaves data sets that reinforce established planning models. Technically, it leaves a pattern that resists obsolescence through simplicity rather than adaptation. The final judgment rendered by both the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus is therefore conservative and consistent. The Leman Russ Battle Tank is not irreplaceable in theory, but indispensable in practice. Its continued use is not driven by nostalgia or inertia alone, but by an alignment between what the Imperium can sustain and what the tank demands. In this analysis, the Leman Russ emerges as an artifact of institutional logic as much as martial necessity. It survives not because it is the best possible tank, but because it fits the Imperium's way of waging war. In the calculus of endless conflict, that compatibility is decisive. Within the sealed archives of the Holy Inquisition, the Leman Russ Battle Tank occupies a category that differs markedly from its treatment by the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus, where those institutions evaluate the vehicle through metrics of output, endurance, and logistical coherence. Inquisitorial impressions are shaped by anomaly, deviation, and pattern irregularity. The tank is not examined as a tool of war alone, but as a recurring object present at the margins of unexplained events, corrupted war zones, and suppressed histories. Its very ubiquity draws scrutiny, as repetition across disparate environments creates opportunities for statistical and metaphysical irregularities to emerge. Inquisition observations of the Leman Russ rarely begin with the tank itself. Instead, it appears incidentally within broader investigations into planetary collapses, heretical uprisings, or unexplained military failures. In many sealed reports, the tank is mentioned only in appendices or footnotes, yet its consistent presence across unrelated incidents has prompted several ordos to quietly compile cross-reference datasets. These efforts do not accuse the vehicle of inherent corruption, but they do question whether its longevity and widespread deployment create conditions under which anomalies can persist unnoticed. One recurring theme within Inquisition impressions is the disproportionate survivability of certain Leman Russ hulls. Across multiple war zones, reports document tanks that remained operational far beyond projected thresholds, even when subjected to damage patterns statistically associated with total loss. These instances are not common, but they are frequent enough to be flagged. In most cases, the tanks were eventually destroyed or recovered, leaving no opportunity for direct examination under controlled conditions. Inquisitorial analysts caution against attributing these survivability events to superstition or localized ritual variants alone. While the Adeptus Mechanicus often explains such cases through favorable machine spirit disposition or exemplary maintenance rights, Inquisition data modeling suggests clustering. Certain campaigns exhibit higher than expected concentrations of these anomalously resilient tanks, particularly in regions affected by prolonged warp instability or recurring Xenos presence. No causal relationship has been established, but correlation is noted and preserved within restricted archives. Observations regarding crew behavior further complicate the picture. In several investigations, Inquisition interrogators recorded unusual attachment between crews and specific Leman Russ tanks. While some degree of anthropomorphization is expected among armoured units, these cases exceeded normative psychological profiles. Crews resisted reassignment, expressed reluctance to abandon damaged vehicles, or displayed ritual behaviours not sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy or Mechanicus doctrine. In isolated instances, crews continued to operate tanks deemed mechanically non-viable by standard assessment protocols. These behaviours are not presented as evidence of possession or corruption. Instead, Inquisition summaries frame them as warning indicators. The tank's enclosed environment, combined with prolonged exposure to combat stress and repetitive ritual maintenance, may foster belief structures that blur doctrinal boundaries. The Inquisition remains alert to such developments, particularly in frontier regions where oversight is limited and local practices evolve rapidly. Unexplainable findings become more pronounced in conflict zones involving the warp or entities known to destabilize material reality. In several sealed Ordo Malleus reports, Leman Russ tanks are documented as continuing to function within environments where other mechanical systems failed unpredictably. Auspex logs from these incidents show erratic readings, temporal distortion, and power fluctuations inconsistent with the tank's internal systems. Despite this, the vehicles maintained mobility and weapon functionality until removed from the affected zones. Inquisition analysis does not assert that the Leman Russ possesses inherent resistance to warp phenomena. Instead, some speculate that its relative technological simplicity may reduce susceptibility to certain forms of interference. With fewer complex systems and minimal reliance on advanced cognitive components, the tank may present fewer vectors for disruption. This hypothesis remains unconfirmed, but it recurs across multiple independent investigations. Another category of unexplainable findings involves post-battle anomalies. In several cases, Inquisition survey teams arriving weeks or months after engagements reported Leman Russ wrecks exhibiting inconsistent damage patterns. Hull breaches did not align with recorded enemy weapon profiles. Armor deformation suggested internal stress rather than external impact. In a small number of instances, internal compartments were found empty despite records indicating full crew complements at the time of loss. These discrepancies are not common. An Inquisition protocol emphasizes restraint in interpretation. Many are ultimately attributed to data corruption, scavenger interference, or environmental degradation. However, a subset remains unresolved even after extended analysis. These cases are sealed rather than escalated, reflecting a judgment that the anomalies do not justify broader intervention without corroborating evidence. Observations also extend to the tank's role in suppressed engagements. Certain Inquisition files reference conflicts that were officially recorded as infantry actions or minor skirmishes, yet internal logs reveal the presence of Leman Russ units. The omission of armoured involvement from public records suggests deliberate redaction. In these cases, the tank's deployment is associated with outcomes that were later reclassified, including population displacement, unexplained command failures, or rapid cessation of hostilities without clear cause. Inquisition impressions of these events emphasize administrative concealment rather than mechanical irregularity. The tank becomes a marker of events deemed unsuitable for dissemination. Its presence in sealed reports serves as an indicator that a conflict involved forces or circumstances beyond acceptable thresholds. This association has led some inquisitors to regard the Leman Russ as a silent witness, rather than an active participant in such anomalies. Certain Ordo Xenos investigations note encounters where Leman Russ tanks engage non-standard Xenos entities or bioforms. In these engagements, battle records describe outcomes that defied predictive modelling. Tanks inflicted damage disproportionate to expected weapon efficacy, or conversely suffered losses despite favourable conditions. Post-engagement analysis often lacks sufficient data to explain these deviations, as enemy remains were either unrecoverable or subject to rapid degradation. The Inquisition does not infer hidden capabilities or flaws from these encounters. Instead, these reports reinforce a broader conclusion that the Leman Russ, as a widely deployed baseline system, becomes entangled in edge case scenarios simply through exposure. Its statistical footprint ensures that it appears wherever the Imperium fights, including in situations where conventional models break down. In several long-term investigations, inquisitorial savants have examined whether the tank's naming convention contributes to mythic resonance. The association with the Primarch Leman Russ, a figure of considerable symbolic weight, is considered a potential vector for belief projection. While there is no evidence that nomenclature alone produces measurable effects, Inquisition philosophers note that symbolism can influence behaviour and perception in subtle ways, particularly among mass forces conditioned by Imperial doctrine. Unexplained mechanical persistence is another recurring observation. Tanks recovered after decades of abandonment have occasionally been found in better condition than environmental models would predict. Corrosion levels, structural integrity, and component viability sometimes exceed expected degradation rates. Mechanicus explanations typically cite favourable microclimates or material variants. The Inquisition accepts these explanations provisionally, but continues to log such cases for pattern analysis. It is notable that the Inquisition does not recommend intervention or redesign based on these findings. no directive exists to limit Leman Russ production or deployment. Instead, the vehicle is monitored indirectly through its appearances in broader investigative contexts. The tank is treated as a background constant against which anomalies are measured rather than as a source of anomaly itself. Inquisitorial observations also emphasize the absence of large-scale corruption events linked to the Leman Russ. Unlike certain classes of voidcraft or advanced war engines, the tank has not been implicated in systemic failures, mass possession, or widespread doctrinal deviation. This absence is itself considered noteworthy. The Inquisition records far fewer incidents involving Leman Russ units than statistical exposure alone would predict. Some inquisitors speculate that this absence supports the theory of technological minimalism as a protective factor. Others caution against complacency, arguing that absence of evidence does not constitute evidence of absence. These debates remain unresolved and largely confined to internal discourse. In summary, the Inquisition's impressions of the Leman Russ Battle Tank are defined by caution rather than condemnation. Observations acknowledge irregularities, survivability anomalies, and unexplained post-battle findings, yet stop short of assigning causality. The tank is not regarded as tainted, blessed, or aberrant. It is regarded as present. Its omnipresence ensures that it intersects with the Imperium's darkest and most secretive conflicts. As a result, it accumulates a shadow archive of incidental association with the unexplained. The Inquisition preserves these records not to indict the machine, but to ensure that if a pattern ever emerges, it will not be missed. Within the sealed logic of the Inquisition, the Leman Russ Battle Tank is neither suspect nor sanctified. It is a constant variable in an unstable equation. Its continued observation reflects institutional vigilance rather than concern, a recognition that in a galaxy defined by uncertainty, even the most familiar machines warrant attention. This perspective sets the foundation for deeper examination of anomalous engagements, sealed encounters, and classified assessments that follow, where the tank's role shifts further from material asset to contextual indicator within the Inquisition's broader mandate. Under inquisitorial review, the Leman Russ Battle Tank occupies a peculiar position within sealed archives. It is neither rare nor exotic, yet it appears with unusual frequency in cross-referenced anomaly reports, redacted war logs, and sealed marginalia appended to otherwise mundane campaign records. This part collates those instances where the Leman Russ was not merely present, but central to events that required later containment, reinterpretation, or quiet omission. Across multiple sectors, Inquisition analysts have identified discrepancies between recorded battlefield outcomes and the documented performance limitations of the Leman Russ platform. These discrepancies do not manifest as singular miracles or overtly supernatural events, but as accumulations of improbabilities. Tanks continuing to operate after sustaining damage beyond known survivability thresholds. Platoons reporting coordinated maneuvering without functioning command vox systems. Entire armoured engagements concluding in decisive Imperial victory despite logistical data indicating catastrophic fuel, ammunition, or crew shortfalls. One of the earliest sealed cases originates from Millennia 41, year 197, during the suppression of a large-scale insurrection on the agri-world Vethros Delta. Administratum records describe a standard armoured advance by the 112th Armoured Regiment, equipped primarily with Mars-pattern Leman Russ battle tanks. Post-action review by the Ordo Hereticus noted that several tanks remained operational for more than 12 hours after reactor coolant failure warnings were first logged. Machine spirit appeasement rites alone could not account for continued power stability, and Mechanicus, after-action inspections found no evidence of emergency field repairs or component replacement. The Inquisition sealed the supplemental findings under the classification of operational anomaly without doctrinal impact. No further investigation was authorized, yet the tanks involved were quietly reassigned to different regiments within 6 months, and their original crews were dispersed across multiple theatres. No subsequent records confirm whether the same vehicles were ever reunited with their former operators. Another sealed encounter emerged during the later stages of the Charon Reach compliance actions. Here, Leman Russ squadrons were recorded engaging Xenos heavy walkers of unknown classification. Auspex picked feeds, partially degraded and later restored by Ordo-Xenos data seers, showed repeated instances of battle cannons achieving armor penetration at ranges exceeding standard ballistic tolerances. In several cases, impacts appeared to strike structural weak points that should not have been visible or tactically identifiable under prevailing battlefield conditions, including electromagnetic interference and heavy particulate storms. When these recordings were reviewed by Mechanicus ballistics specialists, the consensus explanation attributed the outcomes to statistical clustering and environmental variance. However, Inquisition marginal notes attached to the same files reference patterned coincidence and recurring alignment of improbable variables. The term appears in several unrelated cases across different sectors, always associated with Leman Russ deployments rather than with more advanced armoured platforms. Sealed reports from the Order Malleus provide a more disturbing subset of encounters, though these are heavily redacted and fragmentary. During a classified purge operation on a quarantined Forge-adjacent world, Leman Russ units were deployed alongside sanctioned Imperial forces against hostile entities, later reclassified as warp-tainted manifestations. Official battle logs state that armoured support performed within acceptable operational parameters. Inquisition annotations, however, note that several tanks exhibited Auspex readings inconsistent with baseline reality metrics, including localized spatial compression and temporal desynchronization within the vehicle hulls. Crew members interviewed after the engagement reported no awareness of anomalies. They described the tanks as responsive, stable, and reassuring during combat. Subsequent medical examinations found no signs of possession, psychic contamination, or cognitive deviation. Despite this, all vehicles involved were ritually decommissioned and disassembled under Inquisition oversight. Components deemed uncontaminated were redistributed, while the remaining hull sections were consigned to sealed Mechanicus vaults. Their final disposition remains classified. Documented encounters with heretic Astartes forces further complicate the Inquisition's assessment. In multiple engagements during the long aftermath of the 13th Black Crusade, Leman Russ formations were recorded holding defensive lines against Traitor Legion armoured spearheads far longer than projected by strategic models. In some instances, tank commanders coordinated fire and movement with a level of cohesion exceeding their training records, executing adaptive responses normally associated with veteran armoured formations or cogitator-assisted command units. Post-battle interrogations revealed no evidence of unauthorized tactical augmentation, data spirits, or external command influence. Inquisition observers concluded that the phenomenon did not warrant immediate sanction, but appended a recurring advisory to future deployments involving large concentrations of Leman Russ vehicles. Monitor for emergent pattern behaviours. Perhaps the most tightly sealed reports concern encounters that never officially occurred. These include references to battles absent from Administratum campaign tallies, engagements recorded only in fragmented vox echoes, or conflicts acknowledged solely through battlefield debris analysis. In several such cases, Leman Russ wreckage was recovered bearing combat damage inconsistent with known enemy arsenals in the region. Metallurgical scoring, energy residue traces, and hull deformation suggested weapons of unknown origin or configuration. One such site, located on a dead moon within the Halo Marches, contained the remains of at least 9 Leman Russ hulls arranged in defensive formation around a central impact zone. No corresponding Imperial casualty records exist, nor do any Xenus or heretic activity logs align with the estimated timeframe. Inquisition SEAL teams classified the site as a non-attributed conflict locus and ordered all physical evidence removed or destroyed. The recovered tanks were melted down under Ordo authority, their serial identifiers stricken from all registries. Sealed reports also reference anomalous interactions between Leman Russ tanks and sanctioned psychers embedded within Astra Militarum formations. In several engagements, psychers reported heightened clarity, reduced cognitive strain, or an unusual sense of grounding when operating in proximity to active Leman Russ units. These effects did not manifest near other armoured vehicles. While the phenomenon was not linked to any measurable warp emission from the tanks themselves, Inquisition analysts flagged the correlation for continued observation. Despite centuries of data accumulation, the Inquisition has never issued a formal doctrinal warning or condemnation regarding the Leman Russ Battle Tank. Its ubiquity, proven reliability, and lack of overt corruption markers place it firmly within acceptable operational parameters. Yet the persistence of sealed anomalies, suppressed engagements, and recurring marginal notes suggest an undercurrent of unresolved concern. Inquisitorial consensus, where it exists, frames the Leman Russ not as a source of heresy or instability, but as a vessel through which human expectation, ritualized operation, and prolonged exposure to war may subtly influence outcomes beyond pure mechanical explanation. Whether these effects arise from collective belief, unrecognized machine spirit complexity, or factors yet unidentified remains unconfirmed. As with many instruments of the Imperium, the Leman Russ Battle Tank endures not because it is fully understood, but because it works. For the Inquisition, that enduring effectiveness, paired with its long shadow of sealed reports, ensures that every deployment adds another line to archives that never truly closed. Within the deepest strata of Inquisition record vaults, the Leman Russ Battle Tank is catalogued not as a singular artifact of concern, but as a recurring constant within classified files that resist final resolution. Unlike relic weapons, archaeotech constructs, or singular war engines whose anomalies prompt decisive containment or eradication, the Leman Russ occupies a category more difficult to define. It is ordinary in form, omnipresent in service, and foundational to Imperial warfare. This very ubiquity has ensured that no unified directive regarding its anomalous associations has ever been issued. Only layered observation, compartmentalized analysis, and indefinite archival suspension. Classified files compiled across multiple ordos reveal that the Leman Russ appears in sealed material not because it initiates deviation, but because it endures through conditions that collapse other systems. Inquisition cross-sector analysis indicates that anomalous references cluster around prolonged conflicts, attritional wars, and theatres characterised by extreme psychological and logistical degradation. The tank is rarely the focus of initial investigation. Instead, it becomes prominent during retrospective review, when analysts attempt to reconcile outcomes with established probability models and doctrinal expectations. A recurring classification marker attached to these files is operational persistence beyond causal explanation. This designation does not imply violation of physical law, nor overt warp interference. Rather, it denotes situations where the continued function of Leman Russ units cannot be satisfactorily attributed to supply chains, mechanical condition, crew survivability, or command cohesion as recorded. In several cases, entire armoured companies were listed as combat effective weeks after they should have ceased to exist as functional formations. In one sealed compilation drawn from the Ordo Xenos archives, spanning 3 separate frontier crusades, analysts noted that Leman Russ formations demonstrated a statistically significant tendency to remain operational even after the effective dissolution of surrounding Imperial forces. Infantry support collapsed, air cover was withdrawn, and command elements were destroyed or rendered silent, yet armoured units continued executing coherent battlefield actions. These actions were often defensive in nature, focused on area denial or evacuation coverage, rather than aggressive pursuit. The classified conclusion did not accuse the tanks or their crews of doctrinal deviation. Instead, the phenomenon was labelled as emergent resilience within sanctioned parameters. This phrasing appears repeatedly across Inquisition documents and has become a terminus classification, signalling that further inquiry is unlikely to produce actionable conclusions. More restrictive files, accessible only to senior inquisitors, explore the psychological dimension of Leman Russ deployment. Interrogations, posthumous data slate reviews, and recovered Vox fragments suggest that tank crews frequently describe their vehicle in relational terms, not metaphorical reverence alone, but functional reliance bordering on dependency. Crews speak of the tank as stable when command structures fail, predictable when the battlefield becomes incomprehensible, and reassuring under sustained enemy pressure. While such language is not uncommon among armoured units, Inquisition behavioural savants have noted its persistence even among newly raised regiments with minimal exposure to prolonged indoctrination. The effect appears independent of Forge world origin, tank pattern, or crew cultural background. As a result, the Leman Russ has been quietly categorised as a psychological anchor asset. This designation does not appear in any open administratum register, yet it influences deployment recommendations in classified campaign planning. Several sealed Ordo Malleus files examine whether this anchoring effect interacts with warp conditions. Extensive testing has yielded inconclusive results. No consistent warp resonance has been detected within Leman Russ machine systems, and no correlation has been established between tank presence and psychic nullification or amplification. However, reports persist of reduced panic, increased task focus, and stabilised morale among nearby Imperial forces when Leman Russ units are present during warp-adjacent engagements. These findings remain unconfirmed and are repeatedly annotated with cautionary language. Inquisition doctrine discourages attributing metaphysical significance to mass-produced war material, as such interpretations risk drifting towards superstition. Nonetheless, the data remains preserved rather than discarded, suggesting institutional reluctance to fully dismiss the pattern. The most restricted classified files concern final dispositions. Across millennia, thousands of Leman Russ tanks have vanished from records without formal destruction confirmation. These absences are typically attributed to administrative loss, battlefield obliteration, or unrecorded salvage. However, a subset of these cases includes supplementary Inquisition notes indicating deliberate erasure, serial numbers removed from registries, recovery operations aborted without explanation, wreck sites sterilised beyond standard procedure. In each instance, no corruption was proven, no hostile influence confirmed. The tanks involved were simply deemed unsuitable for reintegration into Imperial service, without justification that could be safely disseminated beyond inquisitorial authority. The absence of punitive action against associated personnel reinforces the conclusion that these removals were precautionary rather than corrective. From an Inquisition perspective, the Leman Russ Battle Tank represents a convergence point between humanity, machine, and doctrine. It is simple enough to be trusted, resilient enough to endure, and widespread enough to absorb variance without triggering systemic alarm. Its anomalies are subtle, cumulative, and dispersed across time and space, never concentrating sufficiently to demand radical response. Final Inquisition assessments do not frame the Leman Russ as a threat, nor do they elevate it as a sacred anomaly requiring protection. Instead, it is regarded as an instrument shaped by the Imperium's long war itself, a platform upon which human belief, ritualized maintenance, mechanical tolerance, and environmental extremity intersect repeatedly without breaching orthodoxy. In the closing remarks of a sealed Ordo Hereticus synthesis, the tank is described not as an object of suspicion, but as a reflection of an empire that survives not through elegance or understanding, but through repetition, endurance, and acceptance of unresolved variables. The Leman Russ continues to serve because the Imperium continues to need something that functions reliably without requiring comprehension. For the Inquisition, this unresolved status is not a failure of oversight. It is a deliberate conclusion. The files remain sealed, the observations preserved, and the matter unresolved by design. In an empire defined by infinite war, some instruments are allowed to remain partially unexplained, so long as they continue to deliver victory. Thus, the Leman Russ Battle Tank persists within classified archives not as a closed case, but as an open record. One that grows with every deployment, every recovered hull, and every improbability that does not quite cross the threshold into heresy.